Welcome, everybody. We're delighted that you were able to join us today. Um, Good morning to those of you who are here on the West Coast of the United States or in Hawaii. Good afternoon to those of you who are on the East Coast of the United States or the East Coast of North or South America. And good afternoon or good evening to those of you who are in Europe or Africa. And if there's anyone who's joining us from Australia or Asia, where it's quite late at night by now, thank you for joining us. I'm David Oppenheimer. I direct the Berkeley Center on Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law. And we are thrilled to have Carrie Rosenbaum moderating this really interesting panel today, because she's the model for so many of our students at Berkeley and around the world of being a teacher, a scholar, a practitioner, and an activist. And her work that she's doing on immigration and on the intersections of immigration and criminalization is such important work. And now we've welcomed her to the center where she's directing our program on immigration justice and climate refugees. And it's a very exciting time for us to have her with us. And this is the working group's first public meeting. So we welcome you. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, invite her to welcome our two really terrific panelists and get going with this discussion. So Carrie, thank you for everything that you're doing. And I'm now going to silence myself and disappear, but I'll actually be here watching.
Thank you so much, Professor Oppenheimer. It's really an honor to be a part of and leading this group. It's very exciting and indeed important work that we are setting out to do in collaboration with folks around the world. I also want to make sure that I acknowledge our wonderful students who have made this possible today. Iana Zhu and Emma Cooper have put in particular efforts, so many thanks to them. Okay, so this morning, or I guess, right, whatever time it is for you, we are incredibly lucky to have two fantastic scholars who have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. And so my intention for this event is to bring them together in conversation after they present some of their ideas to you in this context. So Maxine Burkett is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii, and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is also a co-founder and senior advisor to the nonprofit Institute for Climate and Peace. Professor Burkett is an expert in the law and policy of climate change with a specific focus on climate justice, climate-induced migration, and climate change, peace, and conflict. Her work has been cited in numerous news and policy outlets, including BBC Radio, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Nature Climate Change. From 2009 to 2012, Burkett also served as the inaugural director of the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy. She received her BA from the Williams College and Exeter College, Oxford University, and her JD from this wonderful institution, the University of California at Berkeley. She serves on the boards of Blue Planet Foundation, the Climate Museum, ELAW, and Global Green Grants Fund. She was also a member of the Federal Advisory Committee for the Sustained National Climate Assessment. Professor Burkett is also a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform, the Lancet Commission for Reparations and Redistributive Justice, and the American Law Institute. And her work, she is a prolific writer, and her work and scholarship is incredibly important in leading the way in this incredibly important issue that is folks are finally beginning to take more notice of as the impact grows, certainly in various parts of the world. We are also incredibly honored and lucky to have Professor Tendai Achume. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and is the first woman to serve in this role since its creation in 1994. She is professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and a research associate of the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of, let's hope I pronounced this right, please correct me if I don't, Witwatersrand in South Africa. She is also the former faculty director of the UCLA Law School Promise Institute for Human Rights. The current focus of her scholarship is the global governance of racism and xenophobia and the legal and ethical implications of colonialism for contemporary international migration. In 2016, she co-chaired the annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. Her publications include Migration as Decolonization, published by the Stanford Law Review, which is one of my favorite law review articles of all time, Governing Xenophobia, Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, Syria, Cost Sharing and the Responsibility to Protect Refugees, and Beyond Prejudice, Structural Xenophobic Discrimination Against Refugees. So with that, thank you so much to our wonderful guests, and I would like to ask them, Professor Achume will speak first, and then Professor Burkett about their scholarship as it pertains to this topic today. They'll speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll move forward with a discussion and end with a question and answer. So with that, I will turn off my camera and turn it over to Professor Achume.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rosenbaum, for having me and for including me in this conversation. I'm really excited for it, and I'm really excited always to be in conversation with Professor Burkett. So what I'm going to do is provide some background on the international regimes governing migration generally, and then maybe very briefly relate the overview that I'm providing to the specific context that we're discussing here. But Professor Burkett, who has more expertise in climate migration specifically, will then pick up and dive into climate migration specifically. So my role in this first part is to give you some background on the international legal regimes and bigger challenges that are implicated in the climate context as well, drawing on my scholarship on these issues. So for the most part, and I'm an international lawyer, and so I will be bringing an international perspective, and I hope that there's some students in the audience or practitioners in the audience who work from a domestic perspective. It's always useful to understand what's happening at the international level. And when we're thinking about things like climate justice and climate migration, these are issues that are inherently international and transnational. So understanding the legal frameworks at the international level is very, very important. For the most part, international law leaves it to individual nation states to determine how they manage migration. And so under international law, states have a fairly expansive right to exclude non-nationals and to make decisions about who they include and on what bases. This right to exclude is not absolute. There are definitely constraints within international law that are imposed upon states. And then there's also restrictions that states have imposed upon themselves. And many of these are found, or the strongest of these are found in the international refugee law regime. And so if you think about international refugee law or the global refugee law regime, it basically comprises a set of norms and legal obligations that states have signed up to in order to create obligations among themselves around certain groups that they are going to be required to admit having signed up to these regimes. And some of the obligations that exist in international refugee law are also part of customary international law, which means that whether or not states have signed up to these treaties, they may be bound by them. So when we think about the greatest obligations that exist on states, like the United States, for example, in terms of admitting people, the greatest obligations or the most robust set of international obligations actually exist with respect to refugees. And refugees in international human rights law are defined as people outside of their country of nationality who are fleeing or have a fear of persecution on the basis of political opinion, race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. Now, this definition of refugee is one that has been criticized for generations now for being overly narrow. And you can tell from the way that I've described it, if the concept is that protection is reserved for people who are fleeing persecution on account of political opinion, race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group, people who are fleeing climate-related disasters or conditions traditionally, conditions associated with climate conditions, are understood to fall outside of the group of refugees who are legally protected under international human rights law. So I'll come under international law. So I'll come back to the challenges that are posed by the exclusion of climate migrants or climate refugees from the legal definition of a refugee. But I want to highlight a number of things about the refugee regime as it's operating right now today in the world. So even for the narrow category of people who qualify for refugee status, what we're witnessing in many different parts of the world, including in the United States right now, is that the institution of asylum itself is under siege, right? There's a contraction of asylum protections in many different ways. And this has to do with a number of different things, but I would say that one of the factors that has been at the forefront in terms of contracting the kinds of even existing legal protections that we have for people who are fleeing persecution relate to the rise of ethno-nationalist populist political movements in different parts of the world. So you see that in Europe, you see that in the United States, where the current administration has really shrunk the kinds of protections it's willing to provide to even people who qualify for the refugee definition, in many cases in violation of international law. And so you see the shrinking of the definition in practice of who an asylum seeker or who can qualify for refugee status is. You see the externalization of borders, and by this I mean countries like the United States using countries like Mexico or Guatemala or other countries outside to actually prevent people from accessing the asylum regime here. You see this happening in Europe as well, where Europe is engaging in violent pushbacks in the Mediterranean, relying on Libya to hold back asylum seekers. The EU has a deal with Turkey that prevents Syrian refugees from being able to freely access Europe, even in ways where they're legally entitled to do so. And so what you see is that even for those people who meet the refugee definition, we're in a moment where states are implementing regimes of hostility that include immigration detention, which is what we're going to be focusing on in today's conversation. So I'm going to talk more about the restrictions or the limitations that inhere in the legal frameworks, but also want to highlight that one of the challenges we're facing today is that even where legal frameworks provide protections to international migrants, states are failing to comply with those protections. And it's not states across the board, but I highlight states in the global north, or what I call in my scholarship, first world nation states, so states that were former colonial powers, including, British settler colonies like the United States, Canada, Australia. I highlight the kinds of exclusionary regimes that these kinds of countries have in place, because they are often very complicit in producing the kinds of displacement that force people to flee across borders, but then are also the most restrictive in terms of taking responsibility for those movements as well. For those of you who are interested in how asylum regimes and international migration is playing out in other regions of the world, I'm happy to talk about that, but a lot of what I will be talking about will be centering on the ways in which nations or governments in the global north or in the first world have really implemented restrictive immigration regimes. So what I focus on, or have focused on most recently in my scholarship, is what I see as a fundamental problem, or a kind of how I understand the fundamental problem of migration governance right now, which is that we live in a world that is politically and economically and socially interconnected across borders, right? Our economies are intertwined, our politics are intertwined, our cultures are intertwined, and it's not by accident. A lot of the interconnection that we see in the world today actually dates back to historical projects that initiated the scale of interconnection that we see right now. In my capacity as special rapporteur, I was producing a report on reparations in which I talk about and refer to the work that scholars have done to identify slavery as the first kind of global transnational economic project that we see implemented on a global scale. And you can think about European colonialism as well as having initiated scales of interconnection that were previously unknown. And in migration as decolonization, which a lot of the ideas I'm going to be talking about are articulated. So feel free to read that paper if anything I'm discussing you want more information on. What you see is that that kind of interconnection and those structures of interconnection and the terms on which colonialism established interconnection end up being baked into the way that international law works. And so the history of the governance of international migration is actually very closely intertwined with the European colonial project and with how imperial nation states needed to control their borders in those periods. Now, what you see after decolonization, and this is like a very brief, compressed summary that I'm giving you, what you see after the decolonization of formerly colonized nations is the emergence of a regime in which all nation states are treated as formally independent, but where you still have continuing regimes of subordination between the global north and the global south, and you still have extensive economic, political, military, and other forms of intervention of countries in the north in countries in the south. But what's lacking is ways of holding those countries accountable for the kinds of intervention that they are engaging in. So I remember I guess now it's about 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. Probably, yeah, 10 years ago is right. I remember when I was writing about the Syrian refugee crisis and the so-called Syrian refugee crisis. And at the time I was writing actually about the displacement of Syrian refugees in the region right around where Syria is, and analyzing how countries like Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan were hosting, large numbers of refugees. Lebanon was hosting a quarter of its population was Syrian refugees at a time when countries in the global north, Europe, the US, everywhere were really resistant to accommodating Syrian refugees. And yet those countries in the global north were very much active players in the conflict in Syria that was causing the displacement. And multiple cases, you see this dynamic where countries in the north will be complicit in creating displacement in the south, but then completely deny any kind of responsibility in terms of taking responsibility for people who are displaced and for their well-being. And you see that law more or less has ratified this kind of approach by having very few obligations on states that are outside of regions where people are being displaced to actually take on some of the responsibilities. In Migration as Decolonization, the paper that I was kind of briefly talking about, I really focus on relationships between Europe and Africa. And I talk about how the colonial history between those two regions actually means that we should understand European nation states as having no right to exclude Africans and other third world citizens who are former colonies because of continuing forms of subordination. But I want to talk a little bit about how some of those arguments apply in the context of the United States. And I have a short piece in Dissent magazine in which I articulate some of these ideas. So one of the things that has been at the forefront of many political debates around my immigration in the US has been the movement of Central Americans, or the arrival of Central Americans to the United States. And you'll see even in liberal outlets, articulation of the problem or the burden on the asylum regime that is being created by large numbers of Central Americans who are coming to the United States. And what has struck me about many of these analyses is the framing of Central Americans as political strangers, these outsiders who are coming, and either arguments are being made on behalf of their admission that frame them as humanitarian candidates or as refugees who are fleeing persecution, and as a result of that, there should be exceptions to admit them, or else there's backlash against them that frames them as economic migrants, where economic migrants is considered some kind of derogatory term, and they're considered people who have no rights to enter. And in both of these articulations, even the ones that are pushing for inclusion using the asylum frame, one of the biggest problems I see is a failure to acknowledge how many of the people who are arriving on the US' southern border are actually people who are fleeing conditions in which the US is complicit in creating. So if you think about Hondurans, for example, who are fleeing to the the US has a long history of projecting its political and economic power on Honduras that dates back to the 1890s, when US-backed banana companies first located there. And you have historians who've talked about how, the Caribbean coast became an enclave that systematically swung the whole of Honduras into a one-crop economy whose wealth was carried off to places like New Orleans, New York, and then later Boston. And then by 1914, when banana corporations owned almost 1,000,000 acres of Honduras, most of the arable lands, the US companies started moving into mining and banking in that country as well. There's a scholar called Jason Colby who's called corporate colonialism, this phenomenon where you have corporations, US corporations, that engage in foreign intervention alongside direct US political and military intervention. And this occurred in Honduras. And you have, I could march you through the history, even through the 1990s, of US intervention in Honduras, bringing us to the present day, where people who are arriving on the southern borders from Honduras and other places are really fleeing conditions that very seriously implicate the US as an intervener in destabilizing those contexts and making it difficult for people to self-determine in those contexts. So the challenge to me is that our legal frameworks have no way of acknowledging the fact that many of the people who end up being treated as migrants worthy of exclusion are actually people who are displaced because of actions that we should attribute to the nations where many of these people are seeking refuge. And to think of people on the southern border of the US as political strangers is both an ethical and, I think, a legal mistake. We should be reconceptualizing relationships in ways that really reflect the way that power is exerted across borders. And I'll talk about this when we come back to the second round of questions, but I think this has implications for how we think about appropriate ways of responding to climate migrants, especially when we consider the ways in which many of the challenges that we're confronted with today have to do with climate-related problems that implicate, again, global North countries in disproportionate ways, and that belie their attempts now to detain, exclude, and fail to incorporate climate migrants. I'll stop here and turn over to Professor Burkett before maybe reflecting further.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those remarks. And I look forward to following up too on some of those questions.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Toomey. That was excellent. And we're all virtual, so we couldn't see my very aggressive head nodding through the entire talk, because the tie-ins are really quite remarkable. And in fact, actually, just to sort of give a little bit of context, when I was at Berkeley, I took a course with Professor Patty Blum, and our final paper was actually on the sort of more recent history around the global weapons trade and US corporations and our relationship with the Second Amendment and the proliferation of guns and its impact on Central America. So part of the gap, and we really could have marched through that very intimate relationship we have with Central America in particular, to talk through how we have sort of created conditions that make it so difficult to for there to be any sort of sound hope of well-being in the region. And then, of course, now that I work on climate change, right, there is absolutely a transboundary impact that is undeniable and really sort of puts into stark relief the relationship the global North has, its culpability as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation. I'm just going to take a second and share the screen that I have here. I do have a few slides. There are some images that I think are really helpful for us to think about or have at hand when we think about migration and the relationship with climate change. Can you hear me
Professor
okay?
Burkett, we can hear
Yeah.
you. We can see your Microsoft
Oh,
notes too, just so you know.
okay. Okay, thank you for letting me know that.
Yeah,
Let me stop that. Thank you.
they certainly haven't designed the perfect system yet.
They haven't
Okay.
yet. How about this? Does this work?
Yes,
You can see just the slides. All right,
I see
fantastic.
you and the slides.
Okay, great. Yes. So, okay, great. So here we are. What I will be talking about today is just providing initially an introduction to the displacement, migration, relocation phenomenon. Talk a little bit about where we are in terms of our legal responses to it, and then we will. I'll sort of close with some of the thoughts. I mean, my task is to provide that overview of climate migration, but also talk about what a just migration system might look like. And I'll just sort of provide a little bit of context for why it's sort of insufficient at this time, and a little bit theoretically about what we could be looking at to make it a bit better. So first, with respect to climate displacement, migration, relocation, the term itself has multiple, well, we hear it referred to as climate refugee status, but of course there are different scenarios that we're describing. And so climate displacement, climate migration is sort of more generally used as umbrella terms. I'll talk more about what that means. But first, understanding what it is, I actually have found that the words of statements of scientists have, when they're telling a geophysical story, have actually often laid bare the geopolitical impacts that we're dealing with. The first is Sir David King, and he's talking about this in reference to glacier melt in Greenland. But this has a larger meaning as we've organized ourselves in the geopolitical landscape, in reference to how we think about the way climate impacts us. This is the world that climate change sees and relates to, but this is the world that we've created. And there are borders and jurisdictions that make the movement more difficult within countries and across borders in the ways that Professor Chume's talked about. But I think importantly, there's this notion that these borders meaningfully define or delimit national interest in a way that relates sensibly to a change in climate. It doesn't. Climate change is indifferent to this political map, and we see the way in which those borders and boundaries actually aggravate the experience of those who will be forced to move because of the changing climate. Here's just a quick primer on the phenomenon. Again, you may hear the terms used interchangeably. You may hear the term climate refugee is discussed. It really doesn't have any legal weight. But what we're talking about when we have this umbrella term of climate migration, the specific instances of displacement, which more specifically sort of can be used to describe the circumstances in which people are forced to leave their homes. It's usually associated with sudden shocks or sudden disasters. Migration is often deemed to be voluntary to some degree. Of course, the question of what is voluntary migration versus involuntary migration is a live one. But it's associated with risks that take place over time and perhaps over borders. And then there's planned relocation, right? And this is an organization or organized decision generally to relocate communities. It's usually carried out by the state in order to reduce a community's risk to external impacts. What we're talking about here really sits more so in the migration context and is, again, that movement across borders. There's certain things we know about climate migration at this point. We know it's already happening within countries from the most sort of developed, like the United States, to the least, such as the Solomon Islands, which has already initiated planned relocations of communities. We know that an individual or a community's ability to adapt to environmental changes may be a greater determinant of climate-induced migration, at least in the short term, with respect to particular sudden or slow onset events. We know that the poorest of the poor are most vulnerable and most severely affected. They usually can't leave, and this is the phenomenon of trapped populations. There's a luxury to migrating. Financial resources or community networks and destination locations are usually necessary. We also know that an individual's gender, age, education level, skills, risk-taking capacity, language acquisition, all of these things will determine whether or not movement's a possibility. And we know that Indigenous peoples are severely affected as migration introduces a disruption to systems of traditional knowledge and is a significant heritage and cultural loss. There are a few core issues that are less clear, and that's, again, how to legally define those who are displaced, migrating, or relocated. I won't spend too much time on this because Professor Chume did explain some of the significant hurdles here, and even if the protections were adequate, they're not generally available in the context of climate-induced migration. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where migrants might meet the elements of the often invoked convention if they're, were denied assistance and protection following a sudden event, a major storm or super typhoon. If that denial of assistance or protection was because of race, religion, nationality, et cetera. But generally speaking, it's understood that the circumstances of climate-induced migration fall outside the convention's scope and protections. And we can see that when we consider some of the scenarios in which, the 5 scenarios that were sort of pulled together by scholars to kind of identify the general categories of migration that are somewhat peculiar to a changing climate. And so we have things like sudden onset events. I mean, we can relate to this sort of fairly well given the wildfires, the sort of conveyor belt of massive hurricanes that's been hitting in the Gulf Coast. And this is happening all across the globe. We just hear about the news in the United States. Slow onset events like sea level rise, ocean acidification that ruins the livelihoods at coastal regions, destruction of small island states, which is actually a confluence of oftentimes sudden and slow onset events, drought followed by hurricanes, followed by heat waves, designated prohibited areas. This is again that planned relocation scenario, and then unrest, violence, and conflict over resources that have been in some ways stressed by, again, longstanding and severe drought. For purposes of this discussion, I'll dive into just one related to slow onset events like drought, which produces food insecurity. And this again, I think ties to what Professor Chume has been talking about, but specifically sort of suggesting to you that these are longstanding questions for research, and there have been understandings about the relationship between climate, food security, and migration. So this is a 2010 article. So we're looking at over 10 years ago, that researchers were able to identify a relationship between crop yields and migration. And they found significant effects of climate-driven changes in crop yields on the rate of emigration to the United States. 10% reduction in crop yields would lead to an additional 2% of populations feeling the need to emigrate. And extrapolating out to explore the magnitude of future emigration, they found, depending on warming scenarios, depending on if we mitigate, adequately adapt in a reasonable fashion, that by 2080, climate change is estimated to induce 1.4 to 6.7 million adults to emigrate because of the decline in agricultural productivity. And I use these numbers with caution, and I can say more about that during the Q&A, but there is clearly the sort of fingerprints. There's a climate signal on what we're seeing in terms of migration. And instead, we are conducting high stakes debates on border control with overt xenophobic themes and expansions of walls on our southern border, certainly, without understanding a key variable. We're also, in the law, I think, having this conversation in a silo. Right? Is this an environmental issue? Is this just about climate and environment and environmental law as we've sort of cabined it? Or is it one about migration, about humanitarian and human rights concerns, one of equity and justice, longstanding concerns about international economic law that produces the conditions that further aggravate the climate impacts? Of course, it's all of them. And so one of the big takeaways for me for this conversation would be, how can we think in a way that is a more woven together, that is more inclusive of all facets of international law, that will need to lean into this phenomenon. But at the very least, we know the media is taking notice. This is what we see as sort of some of the articles that came out of the migrant caravan discussion. Some sort of head scratching thinking, well, is there a climate story here? And of course, as Professor Chume said, and we were talking about, there's a long history, and that is being further accelerated by the changing climate. Last year, there was an Above the Fold Sunday New York Times article on Central American migration and climate change. And in particular, there was a reference to the weather being crazy, right? Everything's out of control, according to this farmer. And in fact, they're seeing that in a more widespread fashion. This is a different kind of driver. And interestingly, in the article, and I think it's empirically true as well, that a lot of the times the climate impact is a tipping point, right? It's certainly presented as a tipping point now. I think over time it will certainly be the primary driver in some instances, but it's already as just a tip, producing profound consequences, right? If you consider relative numbers, for example, we can see that just a small number of migrants can totally upend the political fabric of nations and the global north in particular. And I want to be mindful here because we are more concerned, I think, in this conversation with the migrants themselves. It's important to note what's happening across, sort of behind the borders in the global north. During the 2015-2016 period, that was so sort of politically charged. There was migrant flows that constituted for Europe and Australia 0.2% of each of the populations and only 0.02% of the population of the United States. But from that, we saw quite a large degree of turbulence. Few other consequences, I think, so neatly encapsulate the features of contemporary climate impacted life. And that climate impact rocks the foundations of our legal systems. Climate migration and climate displacement is I think, a paramount example of that. From notions of agency and self-determination to fixed concepts of the nation state, the changes that are forecast and the acceleration in the rate of change for climate change beg for new and dynamic legal frameworks and paradigms. And here I want to sort of shift to legal feedbacks and pathways and really honor a former professor of mine, David Karen, who was at Berkeley for quite some time. He presaged this kind of predicament some 30 years ago. He wrote this article in 1990 when law makes climate change worse. He's talking about the context of the law of baselines in light of rising sea levels. And what he's doing here is using the term positive feedback loops in climate science, and instead describing how feedback loops work in the law. He said, legal feedbacks will not alter the amount of climate change, but will aggravate the suffering that will accompany such change. The greater the change, the greater the aggravation. There's an important footnote I'd like to include here, regarding that first sentence. This is true in 1990, but there was a significant gap in action, right, reflecting sort of the dangerous absence of aggressive emissions reductions and agreements around that, the appropriate reining in of large-scale carbon-intensive development, including incredible upticks in our emissions here in the United States. These legal feedbacks have actually altered the amount of climate change for the worse. But in addition to that, today, the lack of effective and comprehensive governing frameworks for complicated issues like climate-induced migration are a grave consequence of climate change, also identified some 30 years ago by the IPCC. These are all aggravations. What we see now is that there are a number of legal and policy approaches, but they still leave a gap. The mobility options for those on the move are circumscribed by increasingly antiquated 20th century parameters. If you are forced to move now, you are either making a move to the rare neighboring country that allows unrestricted entry. There's formal international migration programs that facilitate entry into high-income countries, such as skilled worker visa programs, which I can say more about why those I find to be particularly troublesome, but also the extra-legal, clandestine, and often life-threatening journey that many seek to get to another country to seek asylum. Most climate change and mobility scenarios fall outside, again, of almost all of the formal legal frameworks, including the Refugee Convention, and it's prompting numerous and sustained calls for a global governance regime to manage that international migration. Some have called for a new legal instrument, such as a standalone treaty to address cross-border climate migration. Others are skeptical that this sort of migration by climate change even differs substantially from other kinds of survival migration to warrant a new instrument. And then, of course, there's the difficulty of drafting and passing a new one or even amending the Refugee Convention as it stands now to incorporate climate change. There have been other recent international attempts to manage movement related to climate change, including 3 United Nations initiatives relevant to migration: the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, the Global Compact on Refugees, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Their task force on displacement is seeking to provide recommendations, develop and provide recommendations for integrated responses to climate-induced movement. And some believe that a combination of those existing approaches like the GCM with the task force, those, if fully taken up, could be effective in partnership and concert. But even though these are not legally binding obligations, countries like the United States, Australia, a number of European states did not even vote to approve the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So we see this pushback in even attempts to cooperate in management. There are also efforts to seek protection in the human rights regime, and specifically efforts by an Kiribati man who was denied asylum in New Zealand, but then sent in a subsequent appeal to the UN Human Rights Committee. The committee itself found that New Zealand did not violate the man's human rights and right to life, specifically when they deported him, but they did in their ruling recognize that without robust national and international efforts, the effect of climate change in receiving states may expose individuals to a violation of their rights, right? Suggesting that future claims based on human rights violations might be available. Still, we see that there is not significant efforts that are firm, that reflect cooperation, and that relevant principles and soft law provisions are may have the right language, but don't have the enforcement capacity. So I think like Professor Chume is describing, and Professor Ramji Nogales, who I think has provided a lot of important critique as well in international migration law, they're offering an opportunity for us to understand how international migration law actively creates refugee crises by its own parameters, with that need to embark on risky extra-legal journeys to seek relief. Given this fact that we will see the relative size of cross-border migrant flows increase significantly, better infrastructure choices can strengthen capacity. And this is critically important at this time. And critically important if we consider, again, it's plausible, not probable, that the globe will experience more than a 3°C temperature increase and possibly 5 degrees Celsius increase. And for context, right now, in terms of the climate crisis, what we're seeing is just a 1.1 degrees Celsius above the normal. And that current status has produced this summer's simultaneous dry lightning firestorms, the fire tornadoes, the massive hurricanes, 100-degree heat waves in Siberia, rendering their June and parts of their July hotter than Honolulu. This is where we are now. And again, we're set to go significantly higher. The global temperature increase would quite literally produce a whole new world. And existing law, as well as lack of relevant laws, can aggravate the negative impacts of climate change. We're still in the absence of better or balanced information on or planning for climate's influence on human mobility to fill a relative void. Vivid narratives are fueling demagogues throughout the global north and some in the south. We risk hypersecuritization and diagnosis of the climate migration problem. We are effectively creating a self-fulfilling prophecy regarding the climate crisis and its ability to produce large-scale conflict. We're making it inevitable, in other words. And regarding those demagogues and accompanying dangers, if anyone thinks they're getting too much sleep at night, I would recommend this book, Storming the Wall, for keeping you up. There's not enough time. I need to wrap up, but suffice it to say, there's a vibrant conversation, planning and investment occurring outside of the formal and considered legal system to actually address the concerns of the border, right? Smart border walls, weaponized drones, among other things. So in the absence of our work, the void will be filled. And unfortunately, I think it could produce worse outcomes. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Burkett, for that rich, detailed, and thorough kind of presentation of your research. So I would like to perhaps go back to Professor Chume, or whichever of you would like to answer this question. I know this is very broad and open-ended, so of course, please bring to bear your expertise in the ways that seem most relevant. But given everything that you've just outlined for us, how should we think about immigration prisons as a response to migration? Oh, I think you're both muted.
Okay, so
no, you're not. You're good. Go ahead.
So I think there's a number of things to be said about immigration detention and immigration prisons, and I think that distinction is one that's important to make. And I like that you're calling them immigration prisons, because in many places the context between immigration detention, which we think of as administrative, are punitive in the way that prison in the criminal justice system is, and also the duration that people are being detained for really makes it analogous. And there's a number of things that I would say. One is, I think, especially in this country, there seems now to be something inevitable or natural about detaining immigrants in a way that we really have to push back against. The US has not always relied on immigration detention, and definitely not at the scales that it's using now. And I was part of another conference not that long ago that was talking about how it was actually the Haitian refugee crisis that seems to have consolidated immigration detention in this country again in ways that I think speak to some of the implicit racialized kind of projects that result in the creation of mechanisms, legal and administrative, that seem facially neutral, but have these disproportionate impacts. And you see this now in terms of who is being detained in these immigration detention facilities. There's sociologists who've written about how unauthorized migration to the US affects multiple different national origins. There's a sizable number of Europeans, for example, who are undocumented in the United States, but who we don't see in immigration detention. Again, speaking to the racialized nature of who ends up being detained there. So I want to start off by saying that we have to put the approaches that we're using in context and not treat them as inevitable. And I'll give the example of Morocco, where in my capacity as special rapporteur, I did a country visit, and they've just decided they're not going to use immigration detention as part of their response, even to unauthorized migration. So want to start off by saying that that is not the way that it has to be. And the problem in the United States is one that has treated immigration detention and immigration prisons as a kind of go-to response in ways that are deeply troubling. And I think that speak to the profit that is associated, the financial benefit that is gained from using this particular mechanism, and then also the political grandstanding that is associated with having images or a discourse that says, we're being tough on immigration by pointing to those kinds of facilities. So I think at one level, there's that whole universe of problems. But then I think an additional layer in the context of climate-induced migration, there's a number of problems here. I think fundamentally that approach is an unjust and unfair approach to the people who are fleeing for some of the reasons that I highlighted, and also that Professor Burkett has highlighted. And it also seems to me that that approach is an untenable one. It's a short-term measure that will be untenable and not too long if people move at the scales that we're thinking they're going to be moving at. So not only are these approaches unjust, I think they're also short-sighted, and they are not the only ways of responding to forms of migration that are unauthorized, even if the goal is to have, protections for society or whatever the case might be. So I could say a lot more, but those are just some initial thoughts, and we'll turn over to Professor Burkett for her thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. And I would say this is exactly why it's really important to consider sort of the globe that climate change interacts with, and the fact that we are aggravating the experience of those who might migrate by sort of the construction, and it is a construct of borders and boundaries that are so firm and so violent, when in fact they are of our making. Not to say that they're not difficult to dismantle or to reconsider, but this is exactly the imprisonment that we're seeing, the incredible it's sort of an internal justification of the treatment of young children. I mean, it's actually quite complete in its internal logic, but it's so obviously, I think, in contradiction to anything we understand about human rights, but also, again, what we know about the pressures that we'll be experiencing in countries that are separated on paper, but in fact have, are absolutely connected and our lived experience. And so I'll just simply say that we have to understand borders as this construct, and hopefully over time, when we see that the violence that can be created just by the legal structures is a real one that is incompatible, as Professor Toomey said, right, with what we see coming ahead of us. The one other thing I would say that is an important consideration when we talk about climate-induced migrations, how to allow for people to stay in place, sort of recognizing that many of these folks, as we've described, are leaving because they feel forced to, not because they want to leave their families or communities or traditions or heritage. And in fact, there is as much of an obligation for us to create conditions that they can stay in, right, in countries and spaces that they would like to be, so that they don't have to encounter this kind of violence at the border.
Yeah, thank you very much. That reminds me of David Bacon's book, The Right to Stay Home. Exactly, which he wrote not in this context of climate migration, but it's equally as relevant, absolutely. Professor Archime, did you want to follow up, or I have a couple of questions from the audience? Maybe if you'd like to follow up and then I can go to questions, whichever you prefer.
No, I wasn't going to follow up. I think that's happy
Okay.
to jump to audience questions.
Okay, super. I have some of my own too. So the first one is, I'm wondering if either of you have thought about refugees and urbanization, where refugees not only face the challenges around exclusionary national migration regimes, but also the exclusionary land use policies of destination cities, where more and more refugees are living in informal settlements. A precarious legal situation, particularly true in global North countries, who often regulate space in ways that don't tolerate informality. Would either of you like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit more. I mean, I think it's really important to first share that a lot of the migration that we're going to see will be within countries because of just how firm the border is, right? And so we will see a number of the numbers that we're talking about when we talk about, you know, say 1 billion people by 2050. Most of that is happening, again, within countries. And a lot of that is that urbanization phenomenon that we're going to see, right? Moving from rural spaces into urban spaces, which then creates a tinderbox, to be honest. And there is some research that's looking at the way that the shift in agricultural productivity in Syria and the movement to urban settings may have been at least part of the story in terms of the trigger. 3 consecutive severe droughts in the region, then producing the possibility, and, you know, combined with poor political leadership, you know, sort of produces the conditions that can create further conflict. And so there is something there that we need to be considering about how we support countries in place. We also know, though, we can see that land use policy, such as it is in certain countries, is actually going to be there have been instances in research on the Maldives and in spaces like Mexico and Mexico City in particular, where we're seeing formal policies within those countries actually criminalizing this sort of informal settlement and becoming a further stress for those who are forced to move into spaces because they're no longer able to sustain themselves in the more rural setting. So there are a number of issues that become sort of beyond the reach of international law, but just as relevant to our concerns about the rights of those in country.
Super, thank you very much. Did you want to add to that, Professor Archime?
Yes, I was going to, and I completely agree with what Professor Burkett said, and wanted to add that even though the question, which is a really great question, focuses on the global north, this is also a challenge in the global south, even for refugees who are moving across borders, that, you know, we think in the international context that refugees end up in camps for the most part, but though the statistics actually show that most refugees are in urban contexts, even in the global south, raising many of the challenges that you were getting at in your question. I think one thing that's heartening to me is that there's actually a fair amount of variation in the way that cities are responding to migration and displacement, and the way that national governments are responding. And so in many countries, you find that there are cities that are more welcoming and willing to integrate migrants than the national government is, creating opportunities for ways of incorporating refugees and migrants at the local level, even when there's national opposition. That's not true everywhere. There are some cases where cities can be more exclusive or restrictive than national governments. And it's important to think about what's happening at the city level, because typically that's the level at which rights are being vindicated, right? As lawyers, and even when we're talking about rights, as lawyers, we think that law penetrates equally at all levels. You have protection in the Constitution, and people living across the country are going to experience those protections. But for many refugees and asylum seekers and migrants and people who are displaced, their fate really is in the hands of their neighbors and the people who are around them in the very localized contexts where factors other than just legal enforcement are going to determine how people are treated and how they belong as well. So I think one thing that's been heartening is seeing even people at the global level within the UN paying greater attention to what's happening at the local level, at the city level, and then also seeing things like coalitions, transnational coalitions of mayors, who've come together and are willing to take action at the local level transnationally, even when national governments have failed to do so. So for those of you who are with an international law background, it's always important to think about subnational levels as mechanisms for transnational mobilization when there are failures at the national level. And I think you see this in the climate context as well, where states like California and other subnational entities have stepped up when federal or national governments have really declined to take any kind of responsibility. So there's challenges at the local level, but I think there's also opportunities as well.
That's also, yeah, thank you. And that's also true when it comes to immigration enforcement, just domestically in general in the United States. There's the level of the national level, and then there's sub-federal enforcement, and then the response to national enforcement that's perceived as too punitive or in conflict with rights, like sanctuary cities. So certainly there are these multiple layers and relationships. And that's actually a good segue. We have officially like 3 or 4 more minutes, but we can go for about 10 or 8 more minutes if either of you are open for that. I will read this question, and then there's another one. I'll let you pick which one you want to answer. One is, what is the relationship between sort of all of these problems and global capitalism, which obviously that's like, a thesis or more. But if either of you want to comment on that, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. The other is, how do we reconcile the international focus on climate migration to that of US-based internal migration displacement when it is also Black, Indigenous, people of color who are and will face greater consequences of climate change in the US? It feels as if those who are impacted internationally are equivalent communities also impacted in the US. So basically, how do we think about all of this together?
I can go ahead. I'll just do, this may be a little bit of a back and forth just because I don't want to, you're right. I actually just gave a 40-minute talk last week on the relationship between racial hierarchy, colonialism, and capitalism, and thinking about and the international legal order, in fact, right, and actually thinking about the ways in which this global economy has been possible through the fiber optics of international law, right? We've actually accelerated it, and that what we see when we look, in fact, in the rear view, we see that there has been 5 centuries of the relationship between environmental crisis and racial subordination, excesses in terms of economic, political, and sort of the violent reach of Europe. The first actual little ice age was, there's a research that has found that there's really no way to explain the little ice age other than the great dying of indigenous peoples in the 1500s, two centuries before industrialization, because the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas, the farming that was happening there was replaced by forests, and those forest stands sequestered carbon. I mean, this is a climate story from the 1500s, right? Sequestered carbon in a way that measurably dipped the global temperature, average temperatures. And we're sort of getting a sense of again, the long reach of this approach, which is both a reflection of the sort of dualism that's sort of the part and parcel of European Enlightenment, the other, man, nature, civilized, uncivilized. These stories have been quite extensive, and that has been sort of the capital accumulation that was necessary, the resources that were accessed, resources, whether they were human bodies or physical bodies in terms of the earth, and marine bodies. This relationship has been a longstanding one. So I'd actually sort of zoom out a little bit from capitalism, which was a mechanism for that, and actually think about the ways in which racial hierarchy and and how it was globalized through colonial projects, post-colonial projects, et cetera, in a way that has created over and over and over again crises, environmental crises. And those crises now are at the door of the global north, which is why we're talking about it, I think, because we could very easily have been talking about it again, like 30 years ago, which is when it was at least live, 40 years ago when the oil companies knew in exquisite detail just how devastating climate change would be today, right? They knew the parts per million. So you could go quite a bit on that. And I would just say that I have a few articles that are coming out on this. And of course, the reparations work with the Lancet Commission is looking at that rear view. And I think the really critical work around that is understanding that piece of reparations. It's about that guarantee of non-repetition. And that guarantee of non-repetition, which is to say, you can apologize, we can compensate or make whole again, but how do you ensure that you're creating the structures that don't allow for the repetition? And I think we can easily reproduce what we have now with windmills. And we don't want that, right? We need to actually go deeper in our analysis of what we mean to by repairing and making whole again in the context of a changing climate. So that guarantee of non-repetition is a big part of the reparative project. It links the sort of backward-looking orientation of that to sort of literally structuring the preferred futures that we'd like to imagine, the alternatives to the sort of apocalyptic story that we're seeing sort of play out in its early chapters. So there's a lot to say there. Is all I'll do. I'll pause because I would also like to respond to the other question, but make sure that we have Professor Chime chime in.
I was going to jump into the second question because I think you've really canvassed the response to the first one, and I completely agree. I think questions around economy are essentially linked to many of the conversations that we're having, and I think one of the dangers is that law can obfuscate those connections. Most international legal and even domestic immigration conversations don't necessarily spotlight the economy and the global economy in producing the challenges that we have. And I would say this is actually a nice way to segue into Isabel's question about how we reconcile the international focus on climate migration to thinking about how national internal groups are affected. And I think one thing to realize or to surface is the interconnected causes or the interconnections among domestic subordination and then transnational subordination, and really trying to find ways to kind of make more clear the ways in which the kinds of conditions that are confronting Indigenous people, Black people, Brown people in this country are very much related, as the question itself suggests, to the structures of subordination that are causing displacement elsewhere, right? The kind of economic systems that are producing precarity here have been exported elsewhere and are doing the same elsewhere. And this is a very old story, right? And even when we think about mechanisms of kind of racialized exclusion through migration. I'm working on an article right now that looks at work that historians have done to talk about how, technologies of segregation that were applied in Mississippi in the 1800s, right, that were supposed to be used to keep Black people in this country from voting, were being exported and used in Australia, in Natal, South Africa at that time, and in other parts of the world to start keeping migrants out of those countries on a racial basis, right? So the point I'm making is that there is a transnational kind of network of policies, practices, laws that involve collaboration among very powerful countries that are exploitative and extractive of other parts of the world, that are part of the reason why you're seeing climate induced migration and those people turning up at the borders of countries here. And the technologies and the kind of logics around exclusion that have been applied elsewhere are related to the ones that apply to subordination, even domestically. And what you don't see is mobilization or movements that are connecting the stories enough in ways that I think would make opposition more powerful. So thinking about what it would mean to build transnational coalitions that are thinking about carbon emissions in the US and elsewhere. And it's starting to happen now, which I think is really important, but centering the migration story, I think would be really important. And this question of siloing is one that I think even affects different minority populations within the US as well. And we're seeing that shift, especially I think in the last few months, where you have Indigenous rights activists engaged with racial justice advocates, engaged with kind of different immigrants' rights activists in ways that I think speak to a better future. So one thing would be to promote more cross-movement solidarity, because I think that's actually the way that you bring about change. And then the final thing that I'll say is that for domestic advocates, you know, for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country, the international framework can sometimes provide an additional framework, including a legal framework, for challenging domestic policies as well. I think within the US, there can be a tendency to ignore the role that international platforms can play in shifting dynamics domestically. And so even just in terms of seeking remedies, I think greater engagement with the international level would be valuable as well.
Absolutely, very timely, unfortunately. Professor Burkett, did you want to respond to that? And then we need to wrap up on that wonderful note.
Yeah, no, I mindful of time, I just would affirm all that's been shared and really sort of recognize that siloing is happening in all sorts of discourses and on sorts of spaces. And it actually happens first in law school, I think. Not first, right? Obviously, but the educational space, certainly it's confirmed and reaffirmed in the settings of the law. And we are taught in ways that exclude these systemic impacts, these structural pieces, and the ways, again, in which the law provides a scaffold for those things. And so in our law school classes, I mean, I'm about to teach international law. I also teach torts. We don't understand that relationship. We don't discuss the environment or environmental crises. We don't discuss racial hierarchy as readily as we should in terms of how it's shaped the present day. And so this, I think, has been a really great overview, right? Landscape overview of the centuries of difficulties that we need to be dismantling at this time together.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And that is the vision of this particular working group, exactly, to break those barriers and eliminate that siloing that happens and create more solidarity across all lines. Absolutely. So thank you so much to both of you for participating. We look forward to reading more of your work and hope to have you back sometime.
Thanks so much. And thanks for convening us, Carrie. It's been really wonderful to join you.
That's an honor.
Thanks, everyone. Aloha to you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you
You
so
too.
much.